สวัสดีครับท่านสมาชิก IOD นะครับขออนุญาตต้อนรับนะครับเข้าสู่ Director Briefing นะครับ GRC Series เอพิโซดที่5เลยนะครับผมกุลเวช เจนวัฒนวิทย์นะครับ CEO ของ IOD นะครับครั้งนี้เนี่ยเราได้ผู้ที่เป็นนักเขียนนะครับเขียนหนังสือชื่อ 10 Years to Midnight นะครับFor Urgent Global Crisis and Their Strategic Solution นะครับเป็นหนังสือที่น่าติดตามมากนะครับผมขออนุญาตพูดเป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะครับเพราะว่าคุณดร. Blair Shepard เนี่ยเป็นคนต่างชาตินะครับ Good evening everyone and welcome to this GRC Series episode 5. The series called 10 Years to Midnight. Does it sound scary? It does not mean to be scary, but it meant to be what would be the role of leaders like us, business leader, in saving the world. So, as usual, before you start, please be informed that the operation during the activities that you are going to be on mute due to the large size of our group. And if you have any question, please go to chat and send your questions to all panelists for Q&A at the end of the session. So today we have Dr. Blair Shepard, the global leader of strategy and leadership from PwC, and he is the author of this book called 10 Years to Midnight. Kun Blair, may I call you Kun Blair?
Please, Kulvech, please.
Many thanks for joining us, and it's a great pleasure to have a writer joining us, especially on the topic that is close to our heart. Sustainability is the theme of IOD this year, and it will be the theme of IOD from now on. Yeah. So I'm just very curious about the name of the book, the title of the book, 10 Years to Midnight. What do you mean by that? You mean that we have 10 years and then suddenly the world will be shut down like midnight?
Almost, yes. And I'm thrilled to be here, by the way. I look forward to the conversation. The thing we discovered when we did the research that led to the book is actually there were these crises, and they had the same pattern, which is they're big, they're bad this year, they get worse next year, get worse the year after that. And if we don't address them within 10 years, something very, very much worse happens. And so we really do mean that it goes dark in 10 years. It doesn't mean, to your point, it doesn't mean it has to, but if we don't address them, they will.
And Kun Blair, where did you get that 10 years from? Why not 5 or 20? What does it mean by that 10 years?
Well, they all had the same pattern, actually. So let me give you two examples, right? One of the crises we talk about is the crisis of technology. And what we mean there is there are two technologies that are ubiquitous. They're everywhere in our lives, right? And therefore, they're hard to change. This is the other problem with each of the crises. They're hard to change, but they're everywhere. And one of those is actually the Industrial Revolution. So it's how we farm, it's how we transport, it's how we build, it's how we manufacture, it's even how we take vacations, right? And it turns out the problem with it is the unintended consequence of the Industrial Revolution is a CO2 equivalence in the atmosphere. Here's what happens. If we do not address it, the coral in the South China Sea and around Australia dies. The forests in the Amazon and the temperate forests in places like California are burned dramatically. So we lose the Earth's lungs. Then what occurs is the country I grew up in, which is Canada and Russia, the northern part of those countries will heat up more and longer than the rest of the world. And so they'll release methane into the atmosphere, which is 10 to 30 times more efficient at capturing heat. So what happens is you lose the lungs and you add methane, and that becomes a negative cycle that's really hard to break into. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse really fast. And we have 10 years before that happens in the extreme. So you've got to think of the answer, you have to put the answer in place, and you have to be largely towards solving it in a decade. And so 10 years. Then I'll give you another example. One of the things we talk about is the crisis of prosperity. And what we mean there is across the lifespan, people feel like the future is not as attractive as they would like it to be. So let me use the people about to retire. So and I'll use the American data here. In the United States, if you're in the private sector, 92% of people in the private sector either have defined contribution, like a 401k plan, or self-funded retirement. Between 55, what that means is they should have saved a lot of money by the time they're 55. Okay, it turns out for people between 55 and 65 in the private sector, 42% have less than $10,000 set aside for retirement. So they're 10 years away from retirement at the most, and they have less than $10,000. Now, for anyone who's ever lived in the United States, you'll know that you can't live for several months on $10,000, right? And so and if you go to $50,000, it's over 60% of the population. So we have the majority of people about to retire in a decade, in the next 10 years, broke. If you go around the world, it's one third of their cost post-retirement is saved in pension plans. They're grossly underfunded. The problem is that's for people 10 years away from retirement at the outside. So in every case, what we found is the crisis is bad now, bad next year, bad year after. 10 years from now, it goes really bad in every single instance. So it was a decade in every case. I don't know why they were all that pattern, but they were all that pattern.
Oh dear. Kun Blair, so you meant that the term midnight could be environmental crisis, which is the point of no return.
I mean, yes, keep going. Yeah.
And also that midnight could be social crisis, which means that so many people will be getting old and have not enough money to live by.
Yeah, so I gave you two examples. So let me be broader. So you asked me a question when we were preparing for this: is what does your daughter have to look forward to 10 years from now? Right. Yeah. Let me tell you the dark story, right? And then we can do something about it. But let me tell you the dark story. If we do not respond to these crises, let's do them one at a time. Here's the crisis of prosperity. People retire without sufficient resources. People enter the workforce making nowhere near enough money, with significant debt, carrying a huge tax burden they can't afford, unable to ever buy their way to any sense of leg up or wealth. And then a huge number of people with debt around the world losing their job and being in real trouble during the transition. That's the crisis of prosperity, right? Significant social crisis. The crisis of technology is we hit a point of no return with the climate, and it actually accelerates and gets worse. And if you think about the country you live in, that means a huge percentage of the country is underwater, right? The other piece is the technology we're talking to each other over. As AI and robotics comes in place, the unintended consequences of that escalate to a point where they're really harmful, right? Concentration of wealth to the extreme, and polarization of society. And another example of this technology is teenagers around the world are having much higher anxiety and depression than we've seen ever. And that's leading to suicide in males and self-harm in females, right? So that's the crisis of technology. Then the other piece is the third crisis is that people are losing trust in institutions around the world. If the two things I just described continue, that will get worse and worse and worse. And when people stop believing in institutions, society stops working. It's sort of like when fish don't believe in water anymore, right? And in history, when you see that happens, very awful things occur: revolution, war, all sorts of, or really bad answers imposed that are unattractive. What's worrisome is those three together form a system. And so if climate gets worse, it's harder to fix the crisis of prosperity. If prosperity gets worse, you don't have the money to fix climate. And both of those contribute to lack of trust in institutions. Right? And then the fourth crisis we talk about is leadership. It's not so much the world goes dark in 10 years. It's that if we don't find the leaders we need, we won't solve the three problems. So it's a second order crisis, but it's a crisis nonetheless. So it's pretty dark for your daughter if we don't fix these things.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Kun Blair, I'm just running out of words because I was imagining my daughter's world while you're talking. So there'll be lots of crises, crisis of prosperity, crisis of technology, crisis of confidence in institution, and crisis of leadership, right?
Yes.
So it's not only environment, and it's not purely social. It's all the combination.
Exactly. They work together and they're mutually reinforcing, unfortunately, right? So if you pose the question, why is Thailand having an institutional crisis today? Why is the U.S. having an institutional crisis today? A large part of that has to do with the prosperity crisis and the technology crisis, right? That people are saying, we're not dealing with the climate. They're saying there's too much disparity in wealth. They're saying, I'm a kid, I don't have a future. Whatever the thing they're looking at, the world looks worse to them now than it did. And they're saying the institutions are failing me. And as we start to believe the institutions are failing us, we challenge them. And actually that, all history shows when you overthrow institutions, bad things come on the back end of that. Eventually it can turn good, but you don't like the 10 or 20 years it follows, right?
Yeah. Kun Blair, could we relate this? Has this ever? It doesn't sound to me like it has ever happened before.
Right? I think the crisis in institutions has happened previously in history.
Right.
It happened around the Depression, and thus we had a war in a sense, right? Sure. And eventually, what came out of that was multilateralism as we know it. You can go back, and it happened. It happened at the time of the Renaissance, actually, right? It was a crisis in institutions that caused the Renaissance. So we've had that before. We've never had a climate crisis before.
Exactly.
We've never had a technology crisis of the kind we're dealing with before. Maybe the book was the last time it looked like this, where it completely changed how society worked. But we haven't really had one of the kind we have where you and I are talking now. And if you think about the crisis of prosperity, you probably have to go back to the Great Depression or the challenges that happened after the plague to see something of this caliber around the world, because it's at all age levels. It's not just the retirees. So I'll give you the example with youth. There are 22 countries in Africa, median age under 20. Total population of those countries is 885 million people. That means we have to find an education and a job for 500 million kids in the next decade. Under present circumstances, I don't see that happening. The order of magnitude I'm talking about, we've never seen in the world before, because that could be 250 million kids with nothing to do sitting on a street corner in Africa. That's a scary number. Right? Oh. We've seen that before, though. That kind of problem we've seen before, but not at that order of magnitude.
Yeah. It sounds to me like it's a perfect storm.
You got it. Exactly.
Now, Kun Blair, now that you have scared us, you have to give us hope.
Yes,
what
so that's
could directors, because our audience are directors, how could they deal with this kind of situation? I'm not talking about the whole thing, but probably in each one of the four things that you just mentioned about the crisis of prosperity, technology, institutional legitimacy, and leadership.
So a couple of pieces, I think. The first thing is recognize the problems and how urgent they are, right? I actually think everyone on this call understands what I talked about, and is probably talking about it at the dinner table and talking about it in the board meetings, right? And so I think everyone understands them. I think there are two things I worry about as it relates to the problems themselves. We don't recognize how urgent they are, right? And so understand that PwC is not a firm that writes the word crisis easily, right? We don't come to that happily. And I'm among the world's greatest optimists. So for me to write about crises in the way I just described them, it has to be really serious, right? And so I think the problem is recognize how urgent it is the first point, right? And then the second one is recognize that while you can deal with them independently, they form a system, right? So it's okay to address them individually, but actually it's more of a system than we think. So keep that in mind in your head at all times. And then if you sort of think about what can a director do as a director, I think there's two domains that directors live in where they have to bring their weight to bear. The first one is the firm that they're governing. And the second one is the interdependence among those organizations. And directors actually are not just directors, they're leaders in society. So let's do the first one, right? In the first one, I think they have to ask the right questions of the leadership of the firm around things like the following. How are you getting to net zero and how fast? And prove to me you're doing it. Are you ready for the physical risks of climate? Do you have a strategy for incorporating technology into your business so you're not supplanted by a platform-based world? Do you have a strategy for managing your business in a world that's going to be increasingly fractured and increasingly localized? And do you have a strategy for navigating a world where the institutions that you depend upon are fragile? Right.
Blair,
Yeah.
I think because you talk a little bit too fast for us, and we have a hard time writing down.
Yes.
So let's go back to if we were the board and we need to ask the right questions.
Yes.
The first one would be when is not the word can, is not to ask can we, but when
right.
we.
When will you get to net zero, and how are you going to show me you're doing it? What are your intermediate targets? Right.
Yeah. Okay. That's the first question. The second question is that do you have strategy
for navigating the physical risks of climate? So do you have a strategy for navigating flood, droughts, weather, fire, and all the consequent results? Do you have a strategy for that?
Yep. Okay. And the third one?
Third, do you have a way of competing in a world that is platform-based? And by platform, I mean technology and the way we're dealing right now, right?
Yep.
And because a lot of firms are going to get displaced. And do you have a strategy for dealing with the people who are going to lose a job because of that? Right.
Yep.
The fourth one is, are you ready for an increasingly fractured world? And do you have a strategy for navigating that? Where I think there's going to be massive pressure toward localization.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second to last one actually is, do you have a strategy for navigating the challenges the institutions that support your business are going to undergo? So in the United States, for example, we are losing faith in a lot of our institutions. The tax system, for example, the regulatory system, and it's creating a real challenge for firms that are trying to do business because they don't know what they're going to see tomorrow. They're not, because it's unpredictable. It's way more unpredictable than it was. And actually, the system isn't there in the way it needs to be, right? And that's true everywhere in the world. Are you, and every firm depends on some regulatory regime or systemic context of the education system they might take graduates from. Are you ready for the ways in which those are going to fail? Right.
Okay. I like that the last question, which is, are you ready for the people who are going to fail? Because a lot of people are going to fail, and when they fail, they will drag the rest with
Exactly.
them.
Exactly. Especially if they're institutions. So I'll give you the example in the United States. We will probably lose 100 universities in the next 10 years.
Yep.
The employers aren't ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
And the curricula aren't the right education. The employers aren't ready for that because it takes too long for them to adapt, right? And so they're preparing kids for a world that doesn't exist. And so the employer has to think of how do I take in people from fewer schools who are not as well prepared as they used to be because the curriculum's behind and still do my job when the pace of change is accelerating, right? Which is kind of the last question, which is what's your workforce strategy, right?
And
In light of all that, what's your workforce strategy?
also, Kun I read somewhere that after COVID, 1 out of 10 charities in the US is going to have to shut down,
More than that, probably yes.
which
More than
means
that.
that that is like a social kind of um, uh, help for the unfortunate people. And
Exactly.
so everything is like is
So,
falling apart.
so our resources, the resources we have to deal with the issues that I just described are declining because actually a lot of the institutions designed to support are failing. They don't have the money because of COVID, but also government budgets are exploding, right? So you can't depend upon the government to solve the problem because they're going to have massive debt that they've got to get out of eventually, right? You can't continue to print money with impunity, right? You just can't do it. So eventually you're going to have to pay that debt down. And so the strain that's going to put on the private sector is huge,
Oh dear.
right? And are you ready for it? Right. The important point in that is, I think the answer to the crises sits in the private sector for the reason we discussed, which is the rest are actually in real trouble in some ways, right? They're struggling. And so the answer to the questions I gave are both business survival questions, but also they're the way out of midnight, right?
Okay. So private sector is the only hope.
I
Is
think
it?
it is the primary hope. I think the shareholder and the private sector are the primary hope. Yes.
Okay. My I'm just curious. You said that private sector is a major hope, but at the same time, if people lose trust in institutional, would it include private sector, big
Yeah,
companies
some of
too?
them, so for example, PwC is an institution. If they lose trust in institutions, they lose trust in us, by the way, right? Because we're
Exactly.
the accounting standard. Yeah. So I think we have to work to build trust. Seriously work to build trust, right? As do, I think this is part of your question, which is it not another question the board should ask? What are you doing to build trust in the stakeholders for your firm? I think that's a very fair question too. Yeah.
Okay. Um, Blair, it sounds to me like we cannot work alone. No boardrooms are powerful enough to
Agree.
do even a
Agree.
fraction of 1%
Agree.
of what's going to happen.
Agree.
And but at the same time, we are so fragmented. We are so far apart. Um, what should we do?
So I think that there's an important point, which is the other role of a board, right? So the people on this call are the leaders in Thai society, right? They know the major shareholders in Thailand.
Mhm.
They know the major business leaders. They know the major government leaders. They know the major institutional leaders. I think that board members need to talk to each other about where they want Thailand to go far more than they have in history.
Mhm.
Maybe coming out of the crisis of the Southeast War, right? That the U.S. was responsible for. Maybe that was a time when you had to have the same kind of conversation. But I think now there's a need for the people who are really the formal leaders of society, informal leader society, which the board is, to sort of speak with each other and say, so where does Thailand need to go in light of the world we're in, and how do we ensure together we get it there? And so there's the additional responsibility of working with the institutions to make them be more effective. It's having coordinated messages across boards. It's interacting with the key shareholders and saying, you've got to put pressure on us to do this, because if you don't put pressure, it's harder for us to do our jobs, right? It's navigating, because all of these crises are socially created. We all created a view of the world that caused them to occur. We can create a view of the world that undoes them as well, but that requires conversation between board members across organizations and not just within their organization.
And I think that that's probably the most difficult thing to do, because shareholders need return, especially short-term return. But we are talking about sustainability, which is...
It's interesting, though. You see, I think it's interesting. This is where you could say, Blair, you're kind of responsible for this because you taught shareholder return in the short term when you were a dean at a business school, right? But think about it. Let's use private equity as the example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people would say that private equity buys low, tears things apart, rebuilds them, and puts a lot of leverage on them, and that's how they make money, right? Okay. Actually, I think if you think about the time horizon that a limited partner holds money for, which is 5 to 7 years, right? And now it's almost sometimes 10 years you're giving your money over. That's the time horizon I'm describing. So it's in the interest of the private investor through PE to deal with these issues, because imagine you don't deal with them and 7 years from now you try to sell the asset.
Yeah.
Someone's going to say, we're 3 years away from midnight, guys. I'm not buying this thing, right? And so actually the private shareholder is aligned with the worries I described for more than ever in history because of how quickly they're coming, right? And I think you'll see, if you look at asset managers, for example, if you look at BlackRock just created this set of funds they call megatrends, right? And they're actually written on the megatrends that we created at PwC 4 or 5 years ago, our team created. But what they're really focused on is how do we invest in firms that understand these issues and are doing something about them? It's not just ESG, it's much more specific than that. And so you're seeing the asset manager and the private equity player highly aligned to the conversation we're having. Right now, there are people who are shorter horizon than that, and I think what we need to do is essentially go back to holding shares in a company is because you believe that you're holding them, you're buying them to hold, not to trade in the moment, right? And if we could establish that as a mindset, which is invest in things you believe in, then the shareholders' interests are incredibly aligned with dealing with these issues.
Kun Blair, you mentioned about board of directors, and they should go back and talk to their shareholders and get the sense of urgency in this. Even though we do that, and we cannot do that alone, we have to do that collectively.
Yes.
Maybe I just use the analogy that even though we have twice more company qualify on the JSI, Dow Jones Sustainability Index.
Yeah.
It's still midnight 10 years from now if we don't work together.
Yeah, I agree. So two things. The Dow Jones is actually too molar a measure, by the way, right? Because there are firms at the top of that list that actually are causing massive social harm. I won't name them because clients of ours, but they're causing massive social harm. And so we need actually better measures even than that sustainability index because it's too molar. But it's the case that the fact that I get to net zero in some period of time, or the fact that I'm dealing with a social issue, it's more interdependent and more complicated than that, right? And so I can look good on the measure, but still not be achieving something, right?
Exactly.
And so it's about real results. The board's job is to ensure that we're getting real results. And so, and actually, I think the management teams of most companies want to do that. The conversations I've been having with our clients, they're all concerned because, they have like you, when we were having a discussion, right? I have kids and grandkids, and you have kids, and you want the world they live in to be better. So personal story. When my sons read an early copy of the book last Christmas, and my eldest son, when he finished the book, said, "Dad, you're going to be known as the world's worst generation." I don't want that to be my legacy, right? So, nor does anyone on this call, right? And so, because we care, it's incumbent upon us to do something. We are essentially the conscious and the mindfulness of the firms that we govern, and therefore we have to play that role.
You know, Kun Blair, suddenly the fiduciary duty of care, duty of obedience or disclosure, you know, they all have different light right now.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
care is about the future.
Yes, exactly. Care is about caring about the future. It's a caring about what we're giving the next generation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you give some good example of companies in the US or in Canada that the boardrooms are already very serious about this, and how do they measure their success?
So let me give you some examples around the world, actually. So first point is I've been really impressed with what BlackRock has been doing related to how do they think about investments, right? So it wasn't just that they made an announcement that ESG is going to be important and that they've actually taken it to very specific investment vehicles around the issues that matter in the world, right? And I think that actually was driven by the leadership of that organization and driven by the conversation they were having with their board, right? And actually, they asked him to step out and make the announcement he made. It wasn't one person standing up and making that decision, right? And what's impressive about that for me is that's an organization you wouldn't expect to step out that way. Right. You just I'd think of them as following, not leading. Right. But it was actually his conversation between the management team and the board that caused that to occur. Right. Yeah. There's a really interesting discussion going on within ABB and their board about how does ABB drive the change in the energy system around the world. Right. There's a really interesting conversation in the British Columbia provincial pension system, which is also kind of an investment vehicle. It's not just a pension system, it's an investment vehicle around what they're going to do in the conversation they're having with the board, right? I think there's a really interesting discussion that our CEO in the US is leading with a colleague around how do we deal with the institutional challenges in the United States related to Black lives.
Okay.
Right. And so I can actually go from country to country to country and show you where there's really interesting board conversations going on. In Toshiba, the conversation they're having with their board around how Toshiba remakes itself in today's world is a fascinating one. And so I think you can find examples, 2 or 3 or 4 really interesting examples in every country in the world.
Oh, by the way, Unilever just came out and
great example.
announced that. So no more quarterly report.
Yeah, great example. So Unilever, I mean, that's an interesting one because essentially the former CEO was asked to step down, right? Because he was too focused on these issues. New CEO comes in and he's forced to do the following things, which is create real economic return and deal with these issues at the same time. Right.
You know what? I think that is the very, it takes a lot of courage to do that.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing to me that's important. If you don't consider these issues, you should depreciate your assets way faster because they're becoming less and less valuable every year. Right. At an accelerated rate because of the factors. I mean, So imagine you live in Portland and you're not dealing with these issues, and the city's a hard place to live. The police force fails. Forest fires burn a lot of houses down. People don't want to come work there anymore. People aren't willing to give you any money. It turns out any company that's there, if they're not dealing with those issues, the value of the assets they hold are less valuable every year at an accelerated rate, right? That's going to be true everywhere in the world, and so it's courageous to do it, but actually it's really silly not to.
You know, I hope there's no accounting standard in future to assess the board's mindset and then devalue the asset of the company.
Yeah. Now, it turns out my accounting colleagues would hate me for saying what I just said, right? But it is true. One of the ways to think about this is that the notion of the value of an asset is really in play today because of the crisis I just described.
Okay.
And so I think it's fiduciary responsibility to ask these questions is the point.
Okay. I got it. Okay. It's like you look at the future of your asset through the lens of how can you keep it sustained.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Got it. What about now? Is there some company that use kind of creativity, innovation, and not only save the world, but reinvent themselves, strategize, energize their people, coming up with a new business model?
So, I'll give you a few examples that are pretty interesting. So remember this notion of you've got to worry about how you sustain your business through a platform-based world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So take Walmart, right? And I think Walmart, the thing we need to recognize about Walmart is that Walmart is for many parts of the world a solution to the prosperity crisis because they give people inexpensive, high quality goods.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm not making much money, I can still have a decent standard of living because they source that kind of good for me, right? Their failure means that there'll be less of those goods available to the world, right? Which accelerates the problem of the prosperity crisis. So one of the things they've done is essentially say, is there a way we can take the physical asset of the store and make it the last mile in a technology-based supply chain? So they bought a small company that they now use as their platform that people can go on and do the electronic interaction with the company. But actually, instead of having something delivered to your house, if you want to, you just go to the back of the store and they give it to you. They go to the front of the store and they give it to you. They actually grew faster than Amazon through the COVID crisis through that model. So this is a firm that said, I have an asset that's at risk. And I'm going to figure out how to creatively make that asset valuable in tomorrow's world. Right? They did the same thing related to climate crisis. They're worried about where their warehouses are located and how they protect them. They're worried about, so in every one of the cases, they're saying, I'm going to look at my entire value chain and rethink it with a model of how do I make it more sustainable in the future. And they're voluntarily raising the pay for the employees working in the organization because they said we had people working for us that were below the poverty level in certain countries in the world. So they've essentially taken on every one of the crises I described, and they've created a very tangible solution to the problem. Now, you wouldn't think of Walmart as a company focused on sustainability, but they're a great example. Right.
Kun Blair, what you just described, it kind of make me rethink about board effectiveness, because board effectiveness 20 years ago and right now are different. Because right
Yes.
now it's very stakeholder focused, it's very
Yes.
future focused, it's
Yes.
outward looking rather than inward looking.
Yes.
So even board composition might have to change. So what do you see worldwide right now in terms of how the board composition, the structure, how they
Great
talk among
question.
themselves.
Great
Are
question.
they meeting more often? What do they do with the management? How do they measure their success?
So there's a really important point. If you think about a lot of the focus on board governance for the last 30 years has been internal governance and financial controls, right? And security risk, probably cybersecurity risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some emphasis on, are you doing what you need to do related to back office technology?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to the cloud, for example, right? Okay, so there's a bank in Columbus, Ohio, that is, to me, a really interesting example of what this looks like when it's done well. So he has on the board one of the best climate experts in the United States. He has a person who's number 2 in the security apparatus in the United States. He has a person who is a leader of sort of gaming technology. He has a person who is really a massive expert on workforce change and demography. He has a person who actually is worried about how you fix the police system, right? And they added those people because they said we don't have the internal expertise to frame the problems. We know how to solve the problems. We know how to frame them.
Exactly.
So we need our board to work with us on framing the problems that we're trying to solve so we can solve the right problems, right? And what's really interesting is that bank was the central actor in the repair of Columbus, Ohio. It was a terrible town. And because he's thought this way about he's been the CEO for a long time, because he thought this way about the board, he became kind of the central actor in making Columbus one of the coolest cities in the United States today. If you go back 20 years ago, it was terrible. And his board kept pushing him and saying, you can't be a successful bank unless your city's successful. What are you doing about it, right? You can't. This comes back to the point about you've got to think outside in the institutions that surround you. They were asking that question 15 years ago, 20 years ago, because he composed the board that way and he keeps updating it relative to the new problems. It's a wonderful board. And, I got to present to them. I have to tell you, one of the most interesting conversations I ever had in my life, because on any one of the crises I talked to you about, there was a person who knew way more about that crisis than I did, right? Because they actually were right in the middle of that problem. There was a demographer, there was a national security person, there was a guy who was navigating improving police force. So there was one of the leading climate experts in the United States, and so I had to really. It was a tough conversation, but brilliant because they were all there on that one board.
How could that happen? And it sounds
A smart
like
CEO, basically. The answer is a really insightful CEO who wanted to be held to account the right way. This is important, right? That the requirement of management today is to compose a board that holds us to account the right way.
Yeah. Talking about CEO and the board right now, from now on, because in the past it's more like board monitoring things and, like you just mentioned about control. But framing the right question need beyond monitoring.
Yeah.
It needs the board to understand the business more than enough to understand the context, to know how to ask the question.
So I think the important point is the board will never know the business as well as the management team does, right? Sure. Except the people who are brought that were from that industry, right? But the average board member won't. But the average board member knows a lot more about the context than the management team does. And part of the problem in the world I described, you think about how fast it's moving, right? You need people, as a CEO, you need people you can have a conversation with around, so what are the problems I should be worried about? I think it's these 4 or 5. Am I right? Right? And you need people who know the context and understand the business enough that they can say, this is why it matters to you, and here's how it's going to play out in your business. They don't need to go into the guts of the business, but they need to be able to make that bridge. And so I think it means board members need to put more time into the role as well. Right. because you've got to think about how do I translate what I'm seeing in the world into the challenges my client, the firm I'm governing is having, and how do I ensure that we're framing the question right? That's a hard job, right? Because the world's pretty complicated, by the way.
And with that, do you see the trend of emerging of subcommittee that are totally into this, like sustainability subcommittee that work with the management? What do you see underneath the big boardroom?
Yeah, so you could see, you could have themes. You think of the questions I was raising. You get a theme, which is, what are you doing about technology on a security standpoint, on a competitive standpoint, on a back office standpoint, on a business model standpoint? What are you doing about creating a sustainable business? What's your strategy for being a citizen in the country, and what's your workforce strategy? You could take that as pieces, right? For me, I think the issue though is they're interdependent. So while there's good subcommittees, there better be a committee of the whole at the same time. Because as I talked at the beginning, you don't solve the one without solving the other, right? Okay. So for example, I'll give you an illustration for us. In the UK, we are seen as the primary, the leading firm in the UK by far in terms of helping social mobility, because we recruit kids from Northern England. We train them, they come and work wherever they work all over the country, and they either come stay with us and become partners that get placed in our clients, and they have really good jobs with our clients, right? So we're a source of social mobility in the UK. We have to increase the degree to which technology drives our business, which means we will hire, within 5 years, half as many students as we used to. We now are part of the problem, because we're serving social mobility needs 50% less at a time when the UK needs more of it, not less of it. What are we going to do about that? Now, I'm willing to bet that a good board would be all over that question with our leader and saying, so how are you going to deal with the fact that you are no longer the source of social mobility for the UK that you used to be? What's your answer, right? And that's a really interesting problem, because this technology meets institutional crisis meets workforce. They're related to each other is the point. You can't separate them.
Kun Blair, you mentioned a few very interesting questions that the board should ask or even challenge the CEO. Right now,
Right.
October is usually the time when many boards get together for retreat, and
Yes.
maybe even September, but right now people still do that. What should they talk among themselves? What kind of question the board should ask among themselves?
So I think you pointed to the important point here, though, the important point, which is we have to have the conversation about the context that the businesses are operating in a really honest, straightforward manner. And then bring that to, so what does that mean for our firm, right, that we're governing? In a way where it translates into the next year's budget, right? You have to go from 200,000 feet to budget in 2 months, right? Usually that doesn't happen.
No.
Usually that doesn't happen, right? Usually what happens is we have this really interesting conversation. Then that leads to a strategy, which is sort of related to that conversation, but not really. And then the budget doesn't really connect to the strategy, right? And,
yes.
and actually over 2 or 3 years, they line up, but it takes 2 or 3 years. If I'm right that we have 10 years, that cycle's too slow. It's just too slow. I can't wait for the budgets to catch up. And the reason that happens is friction at every step in the process, right? We have a really healthy conversation, and then the management team will say, but I can't move that fast. So we have to keep some things stable, right? And we have to change the system, and it takes a while to change the system. And then the functions will say, but I have steady state investment I'm going to do. I only have 2 or 3% in the margin anyway. So why are you asking me to make these big changes, right? And over time that changes. We don't have that time. That's my point.
Yeah.
So you got to go from the conversation at the retreat to budget in 1 year, in one cycle, not 2 or 3 or 4 cycles.
But Kun Blair, if someone could come up with the key assumption, because the board and the management should talk about the key assumption.
Yes.
3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and use that key assumption to be the guiding light of the business.
Yes, agree. So I think
can you provide that?
I think there's an interesting issue in the following sense, which is I think what you need to do is say, go out 5 years or 8 years or 10 years and say, what does this business need to look like in that time period?
Yeah.
And then come back to what do we have to do this year to start the process? Now, it turns out what will happen is that most people will say, I want to know the plan from year 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, right? It turns out we don't know enough to do that, right? So what you need to do is say, if this is what I need to look like, what must I do next year to have any chance of getting there? Right. And then so have a really, really strong 1 year plan and maybe a 2 year plan, but revisit it on an annual basis because they're going to learn. So I'll give you an example. Walmart has no idea how to compete in a platform-based world. They're going to have to review that this year and say, did we have it right? They made a play. They've learned a lot. Now they're going to recast the play next year and learn a lot again. They have no idea how to deal with flooding in warehouses. They've made a play that, and so essentially it's more dynamic than it is linear. But you should know what you got to do next year, right? And part of the nice thing about that model, by the way, is if I said to a management team, give me a 3-year cycle, it allows the firm to cheat for 2 years. We don't have that time, right? So tell me what your vision looks like 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Pick the time period. Now tell me what you're doing this year and make it really serious.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Hello. Yep. Okay. Kun Blair?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can, yes.
I heard some noise in the back, but it's okay. There are some questions from our audience. Let me get that question out, but it's about it's about making the business plan in this. I think we are talking about that, but I think they want more detail about 10 years to midnight and the business plan along that 10 years. Right. What does it look like?
So let me tell you the process. Okay, I'll tell you what we did. Okay, so what we did was we actually sat down and went through a kind of 3-step process, which is what are the crises really, and how are they happening at a global level and in the 5 or 6 countries most important to us? And we really dug into those. Right? PwC, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Now I'm talking PwC because that's my job, right? As internal.
Yeah, sure.
Showing you what it looks like, right? Then what we did is say, what does that mean for our clients? And so for the person on this call, it would mean, what does it mean for their customer? And what does it mean for the other stakeholders, right? And so we turned it into what does it mean for our clients? And then we said, therefore, what must we do over a 5-year time period, right? And we essentially went out 5 years and said, 5 years from now, we have to roughly look like this, okay? And it was pretty dramatic, by the way. We need to be customer-centered rather than line of service based. We need to be able to have a conversation with the client about the transformation they need to go through and be able to deliver on that. We're missing a whole set of capabilities to deliver on that. We need to change what reporting looks like. Yes. Think about the word I just described. We got to completely change the meaning of reporting. And so we said, so in the future, we'll look like the following 5 years from now. And now this year, what are the steps we have to take that fit a few categories? First, how do we change our portfolio? Second, how do we change our investments? Third, how do we change the way we talk to a client and then follow through on that? Fourth, how do we have to make what structural changes we're going to make? And finally, how are we going to make sure we don't look like we live in a glass house? So we announced we're going to need net zero by 2030. And what are we going to do about that? We are actually being transparent about what we pay people. And it's ugly right now, but we'll fix it over time. So we asked those 5 questions. And then we said, now give us a budget. Every territory, give us a budget. And if it isn't showing progress in 1 year on those 5 issues, we're sending it back to you. And we're iterating again until you come back with something that looks like you're really making progress. Right. And so it is, in the end, the conversation starts at 200,000 feet and gets to granularity in the cycle. It's hard work, by the way, particularly for us, because the territories are very different. So PwC Thailand is completely different from PwC US, is completely different from PwC Russia. So our team and others are working with the territories to translate that high level construct into the action within each of the territories and what it means for them. And so it's hard work, but it's within that cycle. And so we're focusing on next year and the second year and a North Star vision. We're not really focusing on a 5-year path, because years 3 and 4, we're going to learn too much next year to figure out what years 3 and 4 are like now.
I like it when you compare it to North Star, because you can't see what's happening 3 years time from now.
Exactly.
Next year, and North Star.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
When you say North Star, do you mean purpose? Or also North Star and purpose, are they the same?
No, I think purpose informs the North Star. I think purpose is the answer to a simple question, which is, why is this business here?
Yeah.
What function do we serve for society and our stakeholders? That's the purpose question. So, for example, PwC's purpose is to build trust in society and solve important problems. That's our purpose, right? And the way to think about a purpose is, what do we do and why does it matter, right? The North Star is actually a vision of what the place looks like 5 years from now. And so if you think about, the way you ask the question of, what does the world look like for my daughter if these 4 things come out? Another way to say it is, Blair, what would, if we actually solve these problems, what could the world look like for my daughter? That's the North Star, right? So it's a world where actually technology makes people better. It's not causing harms for people. It's a world where actually we've got the climate under control and species are coming back. It's a world where there's thriving local economies that are interdependent around the world. It's a world where, I can do that story. And I describe that world and say, that's what I want to build, right? So I paint that picture and then say, if we want to do that, what do we have to do next year? Okay. And let me do that. Let me do it at the level of the world to give the example, right? So I gave you kind of the picture. The other piece is, it's a place where people trust the institutions in the countries that they live in, and people feel like the future is going to be better than the current reality, right? That's a shorthand version of the picture. So what do we have to do this year to get it to happen? First thing is, I got to persuade the world we have some crises, which is why you and I are talking, right? Second thing, we probably ought to pick 1 or 2 really important issues and get at them really, really fast. And for me, that would be climate and creation of small business, right, around the world. Those would be the 2 I'd focus on. Third, we have to rethink the model for how an political economy operates. So it's not just global, it's global, thriving local economies first. It's not just technology is great. It's technology where we put people first. It's not just GDP, it's more inclusive measures. Rethink the economy and begin changing what we teach in schools, how we govern organizations, how we run institutions consistent with that, right? And we'd start that this year, and then we'll figure out what we learn, and next year we'll go do the next one. I don't know what the next one is, but it'll be something that comes from the lessons learned, right? So that's how I change the world if I had control, which I don't, but that's how I change the world. Does that make sense as a model?
It does. Okay, so rethink economic growth. Okay.
But rethink so here's how we got here, by the way. Just think of it this way. After the Second World War, we had massive success for 70 years. And there were 3 assumptions that drove that success. Globalization is good. Think about Singapore, right? Globalization is good. Technology is good. And a simple measure of success are the best way to run a country or a business. So shareholder value for a company, GDP for a country, right?
Yes.
Those three assumptions. And actually, they worked because our problem was we didn't have enough economic growth. We had destroyed the world, right? And then what happened is, just as we were getting economic growth to happen, we brought on China and India and other parts of Asia, and we had to integrate them into a global economy. And so we had to do it again. The problem is they're too simple, right? They're really good for focus, but they're too simple because it turns out globalization with technology creates a very few places that are highly successful and the rest left behind.
Yeah.
Right. Technology left to its own devices causes social harms and concentrates wealth.
Yeah.
GDP, if you measure GDP, you miss that because you see the country's doing great, but you're missing all the parts of the country being left behind, right?
Yeah.
So we need a more sophisticated model of what an economy should look like. So I would say thriving local economies first, then globalization.
Yeah.
Technology, yes, but only when we've thought about its intended and unintended consequences for people and human systems. And simple measures are great as long as you include measures of inclusiveness and interdependence in your measures, right? So a slightly more sophisticated view of that model. That's a lot of work, by the way, because I just changed the entire business school curriculum in every country in the world. Non-trivial problem, right, with what I just said.
It's like, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so a lot of work.
It's like we have to rethink the business operating model of our
Exactly,
society.
the operating model for the world, exactly.
For the
And then
society.
each business needs to do the same thing. And the questions I was asking were you could think of as operating model questions for every business. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So if one single unit could work, then it could scale up.
Exactly. Now this is an important point, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Which is if because this comes back to it's actually 10 million things at a time. And if we can get a few examples and we can copy them, then the world can scale.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why your question about give me some examples. Now, the thing I want to highlight, though, is in every country, there are already good examples in that country, every country in the world. So when you said, give me the US and Canada, the reason I insisted on going other places is I want to highlight that there are really, really thoughtful people already doing this in every place in the world.
And this operating model can mean the supply chain of your business too.
You got it. It's the entire value chain of your business, supply chain included. Yes, the entire value chain.
Okay, now I start to see how business directors need to, this is about rethink, this is about flipping the mind.
Exactly. So in the article we wrote, that was a companion article to the book, we wrote an article about how should companies think about it. And we'll send you the link if you want to send it out to people. We essentially say the thought process a company has to go through is how do I repair the damage of COVID? How do I fix my balance sheet? How do I bring customers back? How do I bring employees back safely? All that, right? They have to completely rethink their business model or their operating system, their operating model. And then they have to reconfigure the business to achieve both those things at the same time. That's a really interesting opportunity.
Sure,
so it's repair, rethink, and reconfigure. Yeah.
Yeah. If you send to me, then I will share to our member.
Yeah.
Kun Blair, the time is up. It's a very, very interesting 1 hour, and this is very eye-opening. I need to wrap up, and then you can you can say comment if my wrap up is up to your standard or not. So we start with the gloomy side, right? The midnight, right? And your midnight is like a perfect storm or that has never happened before. And then we start talking about the good example of a
Mhm.
company or organization that start to do something. And then with the problem that we mentioned, you talk about that there are four elements of the crisis. The first one is prosperity. The second
Yeah.
one is technology. The third one is institutional legitimacy. And the fourth one is leadership, right?
Yes.
And then you said that private sector is probably one of the very few hope.
Yes.
Directors are, in that case, very important.
Yes.
So directors need to be more future savvy
Yes.
and ask the right question to the management. Uh, I wrote down the when are we got net zero by the
Yeah.
year X.
Yes.
Strategy to navigate the environmental crisis, strategy to compete on the platform base, how to strategy to deal with people who are out of job and it sounds like inequality, fractured world, localization, and most I think this is really important how to cope with low public trust.
Yes.
And you talk about the from directors to that it's important that right now we need to formalize to form a northern star.
Yeah.
What would that northern star look like 10 years from now? But we cannot have that form of northern star if we cannot ask what will happen to our customers 10 years from now,
Right.
right? So with that, we work back into today. But today and this year and that northern star, we have to adjust because the world is changing.
Yes.
And so that sounds like what you just said.
So I need to take you on the road. You did a great job. um, Let me just emphasize two things. The technology crisis is both IT and industrial system, and climate is a result of the industrial system. And IT, it's the failure of human systems, right? And I think the only other thing I'd add is you've got to put urgency into those conversations.
Yep.
If there's any one theme for me that came from the book is I was personally surprised at how fast it's coming. And I therefore bet a lot of us are. And so it's more urgent than we think. That's the only thing I would add those to what you said.
And it takes the leader to rethink operating model of
Yes.
the business, supply chain, society, even
The
countries.
relationship to society, exactly. And the relationship to all their stakeholder constituents, right? And I think the job of the board is to ensure that the problems are framed right so the business acts on them and then hold them to account. Yeah. That's kind of a fun job, by the way. The board members
Oh
job, more interesting,
no!
way more interesting.
I hope 10 years time from now, I'm gonna interview you again and say that you're wrong. I hope you're wrong.
I would love to be wrong. I really want to be wrong on this one, by the way. I want to be proven
Exactly.
wrong.
Yeah. Anyway, many thanks,
Great. Thank you.
Kun Blair. Thanks to you for this very inspiring, a little bit spooky conversation, but it's mindset shifting actually. Thanks everyone for your support as always, the members to us IOD. Thank you, Bangjak Corporation, K-Bank, and PTT for the sponsorship and your long-term support. And thanks to the technology partner Cisco System for the WebEx. We have some announcement for the next two activities. The first one is Independent Director Forum. We will be talking about Insight CEO succession planning. This is going to be really interesting, and it's on Thursday, October the 29th, so which means it's this week. The second one is director's briefing on driving organizational culture from the boardroom. How can the boardroom drive the culture of organization and make it the enabler and make the company and the society more sustainable? So, till then, thank you and good night. สวัสดีครับ